¿Cómo están ustedes? Bienvenidos a esta segunda jornada de Smart City Expo Santiago de Chile. Tendremos charlas, exposiciones, diferentes sesiones, así es que no se lo pueden perder. Y los invitamos desde ya a seguirnos a través de nuestras redes sociales, nuestra transmisión en streaming, entre otras cosas. Y especialmente vamos a comenzar con una charla muy especial, una charla motivacional de Mariela Alfonso. Esa va a empezar en unos momentos. Los queremos invitar a asistir a las distintas sesiones monográficas de los partners comerciales, Entel, Avaya, Sixbel e Idemia, todo eso por el canal 1. Y también las sesiones de vulnerabilidad urbana, los riesgos en la ciudad resiliente o planificación estratégica en la acción pública, entre otros. Por el canal 2 no se pueden perder un conversatorio coorganizado por Corfo y la Asociación Chilena de Municipalidades. Estaremos hoy día contando con la participación de Leopoldo Arnaiz Eguren, presidente ejecutivo del Consejo Consultivo de FLACMA. FLACMA es la Federación Latinoamericana de Ciudades y Municipios, en una sesión coorganizada por la Asociación Chilena de Municipalidades. Tendremos hoy además la entrega de los Smart City Awards 2020 y la ceremonia de premiación de la 7ª edición del concurso Gobernarte, el arte del buen gobierno del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Pero ya les contaba, empezaremos nuestra jornada con una charla muy especial, una de las más importantes de los Smart City Awards Santiago. Ella es Mariela Alfonso, founder and CEO de State of Place de Estados Unidos. Dará una mirada respecto al COVID-19, desigualdades estructurales, también injusticias espaciales. Esta pandemia es algo donde la propia doctora Alfonso nos dará una mirada respecto a las 10 consecuencias clave de esta crisis que estamos viviendo, esta crisis en salud, pero específicamente en la creación de ciudades en este nuevo mundo. ¿Cómo pensamos la creación de lugares hasta la necesidad de centrar todos nuestros esfuerzos en la equidad? ¿O cómo podemos aprovechar el poder de la tecnología para generar entornos más habitables, equitativos, saludables y sostenibles, donde todos podamos acceder y también apreciar? A continuación le damos la bienvenida a la doctora Mariela Alfonso. Welcome.
Gracias, gracias. Bien, ok. This is my home, my adopted home, Shanghai. On January 21st, I left Shanghai for Boston via LA for a 3 to 4 week trip. I remember telling the Customs Patrol officer to be careful, that there was a nasty virus going around in China and that he should use a lot of Purell. It turns out we now know that the first coronavirus case in the US was also documented on January 21st. And no, it wasn't me. On January 22nd, the first case was reported in Shanghai. 5 days later, my husband joined me in Boston as it became clear the virus was a real threat. Fast forward to today, December 11th marks our 326th day in what I've come to call pandemic suburban exile with my in-laws. But in the 2 months following my departure from Shanghai, as the virus spread through Wuhan, Shanghai, and the rest of China, it became clear that COVID had changed and would change city life as we once knew it. COVID brought Shanghai to its knees. Normally bustling with near endless numbers of pedestrians and bicyclists, people waiting for their daily jianbing, the delicious equivalent of a Chinese breakfast burrito, delivery scooters whipping by, little old ladies dancing in public squares, both official and makeshift, and restaurants and bars buzzing, was in fact deserted. Our friends shared pictures of dead public spaces, abandoned streets, shuttered stores, empty subways, images that would sadly become all too common worldwide. And the devastation continues. For me, in those 2 months of watching my beloved city lose its soul, I braced myself for the fact that this fate would be bestowed on us too. There was no shelter from this looming pandemic storm. But amidst the calm ahead of the deluge of devastation that was to come, while the country fixated on what was happening outside its doors, I obsessed about what this pandemic meant for the public realm, for public life. As someone who had devoted her life to quantifying how place, the built environment, could be used as a means by which to make people happier, healthier, safer, what was to be my role as an urban design researcher, professor, and entrepreneur, when what was necessary for us to stay safe, healthy, was the exact opposite of my mission to leverage data and evidence to advocate for better places that brought people together? If our collective jobs were to make cities people magnets, and yet to remain safe, we'd have to intentionally avoid places that were indeed magnets for people, what was to be our purpose now? Today, 10 months and 21 days into incessantly fleshing out answers to these questions, when viral pictures of empty public spaces are no longer alarming, and spontaneous performance of singers and musicians erupting out of balconies are mostly a distant memory, and the light of so many people and places has been darkened, some forever, it's clear that in addition to the devastating loss of over 1 million people worldwide, we've also collectively been mourning the loss of public life. People crave other people and they need places to gather. It's part of the human condition. And yet, so too, apparently, are pandemics. The fact is, we've entered a brave new world. The world pre-COVID will never be the same post-COVID. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The way we think about the built environment, public space, who it's designed for, who designs it, who gets access to it, who makes decisions about it, it needed not just a monumental rethink, but a fundamental reshift in priorities. I believe there are 10 key issues that need to be readdressed in order to enter this brave new world, equipped with the mindset and tools necessary to once again spark joy, but do so in a way that heals, in a way that is just, in a way that is equitable. So first, COVID has forced us to remember the basics. There's a two-way street between the physical environment and behavior. Urban design should facilitate certain behaviors and feelings, and we in turn can or should be able to shape the built environment. When we understand and encourage this relationship, it creates value: economic, social, environmental, safety, and yes, health value. But we've been missing the person part of this equation. Even pre-COVID, our prevalent planning paradigm has been paternalistic. We'll know what's better. We'll design what we think you need, what we believe is good for you. This top-down, expert-led approach fails to provide the affordance, the ability to adapt public spaces to all contexts and needs for everybody. Take social distancing. This doesn't preclude us from using parks or sitting in a plaza if we've designed public spaces well, if we allow for movable chairs that folks can rearrange to befit distancing recommendations, for example, or design in both active and passive uses where the former are pre-designed to allow for more privacy while still engaging publicly. This can actually act as a refuge, as a place for restoration. We must consider the fundamental equation that the environment plus behavior equals value when configuring public spaces, and broaden from a small d design to a big D design thinking framework to build more resilient and adaptable places that can spark joy no matter what. Next, COVID has forced us to redefine or broaden what we mean by place making, city making. Places are socially constructed phenomenon. We give them meaning, not the other way around, or at least that's the case with good bottom-up public spaces. In the post-COVID world, we have been compelled to broaden our definition of what we mean by places. Pre-COVID, we already had examples of many virtual places, all of social media, virtual workplaces, webinars, augmented places, and even virtual spaces. Post-COVID, given that our purpose, our jobs is to create magnets for people, naturally this must and did extend to virtual magnets and non-physical places. Now we know these places cannot and have not replaced the physical connection we get from real places. But I have been encouraged by the innovation sparked by this pandemic to reimagine virtual alternatives to public spaces. Many museums opened their virtual doors. Many parks and public spaces allowed for virtual tours, and even online cooking classes transported you into the homes of people all over the world. But I believe we can take this even further by allowing groups of people to virtually travel together to these places in a way that might mimic the joyous, spontaneous interactions that public spaces provide us with. These kinds of virtual places could help us skip the social part of the distancing and just keep to ruling out the physical aspect of interactions. But imagine too what this would mean for the many people who in everyday non-pandemic life cannot already physically participate in these magnets we spend so much time carefully curating. People with disabilities, the elderly, the sick, those without physical means to access places, or people who are not fortunate enough to have these places in their neighborhoods. The lack of access pre-COVID is yet another equity issue that already exists and already needs fixing. And speaking of equity, if the ramifications of this global pandemic have not opened our eyes to the fact that the way we design places, cities, is inherently structurally inequitable, well, I guess I'll continue to scream about it. How many holes in the system has this crisis glaringly exposed? For starters, throughout the pandemic, people have avoided public transit. On the one hand, this means more people have been biking and walking. But what about those for whom this isn't feasible because they live in places not designed to allow for those behaviors, or they have disabilities? Even if you argue that fewer people taking transit means that it's at lower capacity and thereby allows those who cannot walk or bike to use it while still practicing social distancing, they're still exposing themselves to higher risk. And indeed, populations unable to walk or bike are more likely to be high risk to begin with. And then there's all the communities for which transit is not even available. And that's just equity as it relates to mobility. There's also the issue of housing. Most people live paycheck to paycheck, and many people have not been getting paid for months. While many countries have put a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, this doesn't address the issue of affordability post-COVID. And then there's even more vulnerable people who are homeless. On top of that, there's food insecurity with unprecedented numbers lining up at food banks, and a litany of other inequities from lack of access to health, lack of access to quality education, to environmental justice issues, and more. And then there's the very grim reality that the most vulnerable populations have been the ones hardest hit by COVID. Why? Because the places they inhabit do not support health, safety, well-being. This puts vulnerable communities at higher risk, not just for COVID, but for all of the other comorbidities tied to COVID, for higher frequency of natural disasters, for higher rates of crime. Inherent to the definition of placemaking must be a requirement that we make great places for everyone. We are failing at this, and this pandemic has served as a giant, ugly microscope of our collective failure to create inclusive, equitable places. Now, issues of inequities make it clear that everything is interconnected. In 2005, I published a theoretical paper about walkability, offering a broader understanding of why people chose to walk or not. It was based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it posited that some aspects of urban design were more fundamental than others in influencing people's choice of travel. It also framed this choice within a social ecological construct that other factors besides the physical environment impacted people's decisions to walk, how they perceived urban design, how many urban design amenities needed to be fulfilled in order to be compelled to walk. These factors included individual differences like age and gender, sociological level differences such as religious or cultural affiliations, and geographical level differences. Everything is interconnected. You cannot myopically evaluate how the built environment impacts behavior. Yet we as city makers at the local, regional, state, and federal level have not been working within the social ecological frameworks needed to address the complex organism that is a city. And despite our failure to proactively acknowledge these links, this pandemic gets it and has unapologetically toppled our vulnerable house of cards. And we're woefully unprepared. Let's fix that. Understanding that everything is connected makes it easier to heed both the positive and negative unintended consequences. At the start of the pandemic, many of you likely saw visualizations regarding the drop in emissions and improvements in air quality in China, Italy, and beyond, as more of the world succumbed to lockdowns, quarantines, and adopted social distancing. That was a positive, albeit unintended consequence of pretty extreme measures. The question is, are any of these tenable when not facing a pandemic? In answering this, however, we must also consider the negative consequences of such measures, besides the obvious disruptions to our daily lives. Denying ourselves access to public life has serious, multi-layered consequences, ranging from loneliness to lack of physical activity to not benefiting from the pleasures we get from third places and others. Let's face it, humans crave other humans. But I do believe the unintended environmental impacts engendered by this pandemic are significant enough that we must consider how more moderate versions of these measures might be warranted, as long as we consider, account for, and mitigate the negative externalities of such. We have some tough choices ahead, which brings me to objects in the mirror are closer than they seem. While it might have taken longer than ideal, the world, mostly, has come to understand how much of a real and present danger this pandemic poses. And we've taken relatively swift action. But what if we could somehow apply the same sense of urgency this pandemic has engendered, the nimble policymaking, the collective sacrifice, the universal coalescing around one common enemy, to tackling the climate crisis? What would it take to transfer this level of measured panic toward the goal of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, toward meeting UN's sustainable development goals? How can we make the consequences of the climate crisis seem as concrete as that of COVID-19? How can we translate lessons learned from this crisis and avoid being this utterly unprepared again in the face of the next ever menacing, lurking, inevitable threat? This means we need to also re-examine our systems of governance. Early in the pandemic, there were many memes of empty shelves with the caption, late-stage capitalism or socialism. I'm not one to advocate for socialism. My mom fled communist Cuba. But this pandemic has highlighted just how fragile our systems so reliant on consumerism, are. Even our public spaces play fiddle to this, serving explicitly or implicitly as consumer-first places. Having lived in China for over 7 years, I've seen the benefits of a system based on the idea of the collective. Yes, when the city of Wuhan and then other Chinese cities were put on government-enforced lockdown, there's no question that their top-down system made this much easier to not just implement, but fathom as a near first step in curbing the spread of the virus. But you cannot discount the will and willingness of the Chinese people to immediately follow suit. For them, it's their duty. It just goes without saying. And this extends to other parts of Asia. There's something to be said for that sense of the collective that I believe would benefit us as placemakers. I believe the present crisis begets us to re-examine what's at the heart of our policies, governance, and markets, and ensure they are serving those most at need. We must also be aware of overcorrections. COVID-19 is not the first time that public health concerns have impacted public life and planning. Euclidean zoning was in large part a reaction to the poor health conditions linked to overcrowded inner cities during the Industrial Revolution, where it was not uncommon to have factories abutting tenements, bursting at the seams with families. As a result, we labeled all industry and commerce as noxious and separated them from where we lived and worked, indelibly shaping our communities and preordaining us all to a lifelong commitment to cars. Early in the pandemic, some conjectured that perhaps dense, compact urban cities are just not tenable in the face of pandemics, while others pointed out that many of the original epicenters were in fact suburban places, born out of the Euclidean order. Today, we understand it's much more complex, with record high virus levels in all kinds of places in the US and abroad. Human behaviors and our systems of governance, along with design, all matter. It's important to heed the lessons from history and not hastily implement top-down, blunt policies restricting density or radically changing the face of public spaces. We need a measured, data-driven, transdisciplinary approach that mitigates risk associated with pandemics and the like, while allowing us to access the multitude of benefits tied to the joys and messiness of public life. In addition, technology has a role to play. I have warned that tech for tech's sake is a dangerous proposition for the future of public life. But technology has stepped up to the plate during this crisis, from Zoom offering free access for educational users who scrambled to put courses online, to delivery robots rolled out in China to facilitate effective social distancing, to health rating systems being tied to social media apps to help gauge exposure. The question is, how can we as city makers harness the power of technology to keep people safe in pandemics and otherwise, while still allowing people to benefit from participating in public life? We must work with the civic tech community to come up with potential solutions. And in general, we need to be more quick to the uptake in terms of using technology and data to make awesome, safe, resilient places all people can love. Finally, while I hate this phrase, we must never waste a good crisis. We've been given a pause here to take time to think strategically, not merely tactically. As placemakers, many of you are charged with managing places, and namely the people in those places. Those people, for the most part, are not in those places right now. You're not working on marketing your next in-person event. You're not working on organizing your next in-person gathering. This is the time for a strategic approach to address all of the issues I've highlighted here, but to also broaden this list. This is the time to throw out the rule books, think outside the box, engage non-experts to both identify additional challenges and solutions. This is finally the time to adopt a more holistic, socially ecological, transdisciplinary, and evidence-based framework for city making that has equity, inclusiveness, and resiliency at the heart of it. Thank you very much.
Manena, ¿terminó? ¿Terminó? Muchas gracias, Mariela, por tu presentación. Son temas que hemos estado abordando en estas últimas jornadas aquí en Smart City. La realidad que estamos viviendo, que está muy vinculada no solo a la pandemia, también al descontento social en muchos países. Sabemos lo que ha ocurrido aquí en Chile con el estallido social, el incremento también del populismo, una realidad muy compleja. Y ahí quería aprovechar de hacerte algunas preguntas. Una de ellas respecto a temas que tú estabas abordando. ¿Dónde está lo fundamental? ¿Cómo trasladar estos principios a la labor de quienes toman las decisiones públicas? Estamos hablando aquí no solo de los responsables políticos, también el personal, todos los gestores técnicos de las administraciones públicas. A tu juicio, ¿qué podrían interiorizar a corto plazo para mejorar su servicio público?
Gracias por esa pregunta bien importante. Para mí, lo más importante es entender que los residentes son los expertos, ¿ok? Ellos saben qué es lo que necesitan. Ellos saben qué es lo que falta. Ellos saben lo que requieren en su ambiente para mejorar sus vidas. ¿Okay? Al entender esto, ya sigue que el primer paso debe de ser ir a ellos primero, ¿okay? A colectar información, a entender cuáles son las preguntas que se deben estudiar. ¿Okay? Básicamente tienen que implementar procesos bottom-up, como dije en la charla, desde abajo, en la comunidad arriba, de los sectores entonces ir a los sectores técnicos, ¿okay? Porque eso es la única manera para entender cuál es el problema en sí, al corazón de los residentes, ¿okay? Además, la gente deben de trabajar con la comunidad para establecer los expectativos, ¿okay? Ellos, porque en los Estados Unidos, a veces lo que pasa es que las ciudades van a los residentes, empiezan a hablar con ellos para entender lo que necesitan, y entonces hacen promesas que no pueden realizar, ¿ok? Y entonces ahí el pueblo, la gente, ahí ya no hay confianza, porque, mira, la última vez me dijeron que iban a hacer esto y no han hecho nada, ¿no? Entonces, en vez de hacerlo en ese proceso normal, que no es efectivo, en vez, otra vez, ir primero a los residentes y empezar una charla para entender qué se puede hacer inmediatamente, ¿okay? ¿Qué se puede hacer en medio plano? ¿Y cuál es la visión que juntos estamos tratando de lograr? Y ya cuando pueden hacer como esa historia, ok, esto viene primero, esto es lo próximo y al final esto es lo que estamos tratando de realizar, ya pueden coger la confianza de los residentes, del público, ¿no? Y el público puede empezar a entender igual cuál es el proceso público, porque el proceso público es difícil, toma tiempo, ¿no? Y cómo entonces también el público puede entender cómo cada paso se traduce en la visión última que juntos crearon, ¿no?
En tu intervención te refieres en muchas oportunidades al tema de los datos, específicamente a tomar decisiones basadas en datos. Es más, tu labor profesional está vinculada específicamente a estos temas. Yo quería preguntarte, Mariela, si podrías nombrar algunas aplicaciones concretas o temas en los que se pueda marcar una diferencia para el diseño de los espacios urbanos o la gestión de la ciudad.
Sí, gracias. Mira, para mí igual lo más importante es empezar con los datos desde el principio. Que algunas ciudades solamente usan los datos para medir el impacto de un proyecto que ya fue realizado, pero ahí ya es muy tarde. ¿Okay? Tienen que ser desde el principio, antes que se seleccionó el lugar donde iban a hacer el proyecto. Les doy el ejemplo de la ciudad de Filadelfia, que es nuestro cliente en State of Place. Ellos ya tenían datos sobre muchos factores, ¿okay? La demográfica, el ambiente del environment, el empleo, todo. Pero en sí, ellos no tenían datos sobre el ambiente físico, el diseño urbano. Y necesitaban eso para entender la relación, como dije en la charla, entre lo físico y la calidad de vida. ¿Okay? Y ellos ahora están usando estos datos para entender, ok, hay ciertas áreas de la ciudad donde la ciudad por varias razones no ha invertido. ¿Okay? Entonces, esos lugares son los lugares donde hay mucha más gente con COVID, hay mucha más gente con, como se dice, chronic diseases, como diabetes y todo ese tipo de disease. Y también son los lugares donde hay mucho más islas de calor o inundaciones urbanas. Y nosotros pensamos que el por qué está todo relacionado con el ambiente físico. Entonces, lo que estamos haciendo con estos datos es como cuantificar esa relación del ambiente y todos estos tipos de cosas que tienen que ver con la calidad de vida. Y entonces, lo que van a hacer con esos datos es no solamente comunicar el por qué. Bueno, mira, nosotros no hemos invertido en estos lugares ya por muchos años y por eso estamos viendo estos factores, ¿no? Ahora pueden identificar cuáles son los factores del ambiente físico que tienen que mejorar en estos lugares para mejorar la calidad de vida. Y entonces, para nosotros, los datos son importantes para entender el por qué está pasando estas cosas en términos de calidad de vida y cómo tiene que ver el ambiente físico a eso. Y entonces identificar los cambios, a veces pequeños, que se pueden hacer para hacer un impacto bien grande en términos de la gente, de la vida de la gente.
Claro que sí, Mariela, lamentablemente se nos acabó el tiempo, pero queremos darte las gracias por esta gran charla inspiracional y por haber estado hoy día con nosotros aquí participando en Smart City Expo Santiago de Chile.
No, un placer. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti. Les queremos también aprovechar de dar los agradecimientos a quienes están haciendo hoy posible este importante congreso. Vamos hoy en nuestro segundo día a la Intendencia Metropolitana de Santiago, al Gobierno Metropolitano, también a Corfo, que han sido los principales impulsores de este evento, a Interexpo como socio local, a Fira de Barcelona Internacional, los organizadores, también el compromiso de los diferentes sponsors del evento que han sido clave para la realización de nuestros global partners Entel, Enex, Hikvision, también los local partners Avaya, Sixbel, Microsoft y los event partners Suez, Uber, Schneider Electric, Ali, Secure y también Idemia. Los invitamos a que sigan con nosotros aquí en nuestras transmisiones y que sigan nuestras redes sociales.